I am not seeing a go live button. Wait. Nope, that's just active. Okay, wonderful. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last panel of the day. So the panel topic, my name is John Lunsford, and the panel topic is on overcoming the AI ethics gap. So joining us today, in addition to myself, is Abhishek Gupta, who is the founder and principal researcher at the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. Apostol Vassilev, who is the research team lead at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and Supreet Kaur, who is the assistant vice president here at Morgan Stanley. And so actually, we don't have a huge amount of time, and we have a lot of questions, and I want to make enough time for us to be able to answer the chat as well. So we're just going to jump into the topics that we want to address today. So the first is, what is the AI ethics gap, and why is it important to address? Anyone want to start us off?
Well, I can kick us off, John, if that's okay. I think when we talk about the AI ethics gap, the way I see it is the intention action gap, right? So uh, at BCG, which is the other hat that I wear in addition to my Montreal AI Ethics Institute hat, we did a research study with MIT SMR where we found that there is a huge commitment. About 86% of the organizations who commit to wanting to do responsible AI, but only about a quarter of them actually have programs in place to operationalize that end to end. And the operationalization includes going from principles to practice, meaning having processes in place, having trained staff in place, having governance structures in place, having in place uh, specific guidance that practitioners can use on a day-to-day basis. And so that intention action gap, I think, is the biggest thing that I think about when it comes to the AI ethics gap.
Yeah.
Awesome. Anyone else?
Yeah, I could add a couple of comments to that. First of all, I support 100% what Abhishek just said, and we at NIST recognized this gap, and we're trying to help the community with exactly that sort of standard processes that organizations across the board can actually deploy within their organizations to overcome some of these shortcomings that Abhishek mentioned. And there's more to it. It's one thing to publish a high-level guidance saying you have to strive to be fair and square and all of these things, but how do you do it in practice is yet another challenge that we need to overcome. How does the employee who is assigned to either develop AI systems or use AI systems in their work know what it means to actually implement these high-level principles in their daily work? And so there's yet another gap between high-level principles and guidance and daily guidance. And at NIST, we're trying to help with that as well. So to follow up on the AI risk management framework that NIST released last week, we're trying to develop additional guidance. For example, about bias, we are trying to develop guidance about how to manage bias in context. You cannot talk about bias in generality. You have to specify which context you're talking about. For example, financial, healthcare, all the other application domains. And we're starting with financial services, consumer credit underwriting. We're trying to get together with financial industry, companies from financial industry, technology companies, all these players in the stakeholders in the field to develop practice guides for how do you map these high-level principles to the daily work of employees in that sector. So I think that's another important element that we need to keep in mind.
Mm-hmm. Supreet, how about you?
Yeah, I think my fellow panelists have summarized it really well as to, the gap is between the guidelines, between the understanding, and then if you're working with, cross-country teams on such projects, there could be gaps there. Their understanding of unethical AI could look very different than, what your understanding would look like. So there is definitely a need to discuss this topic, to have something, one clear picture all under the umbrella so that everyone can follow it. And obviously it's difficult if you see that, okay, will we have something in common between industries and, between countries? No, but at least we can start, from a company, have those guidelines, and then probably build on it.
Yeah, I agree. I think any kind of guidance is highly contextual based on the environment in which it's deployed and especially the kinds of data through which it needs to navigate in order to produce whatever you're trying to produce. So how do we ensure that the systems that we're building are inclusive and don't perpetuate existing harms or existing biases?
Right. I mean, I can kick this off, from a data standpoint. That's what I do day in and day out. My expertise is in building data products. So obviously, we talk about bias perpetuating in the AI products, but more so, I think that it actually creeps in your data more than your model, because obviously, your data is feeding your AI model. So I think that the checks and all the fairness and bias testing first needs to be done on the data level to ensure that your data is fair, and that could be in terms of diversification. How are you procuring your data? You need to make sure that the source is accurate, and obviously there's some mathematical checks that you can do, but along with that you also have to combine like the SME knowledge to see what's missing and what could be enhanced to make that data, let's say, unbiased.
Mm-hmm. Apostol, Abhishek, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure. Supreet is exactly right. Data is a very critical component in which we need to look at in order to find ways to de-bias it. Data is a historical sort of view on what AI can do today. Data is accumulated over a period of time, and obviously there's all kinds of historical issues that enter there that may exhibit themselves in the data that you're consuming to work with. And so it's important, as Supreet said, to know where the data comes from, who is represented in this data, whether all stakeholders actually had a view, had a representation there. But it's not just data. Biases come in other areas. You have systemic biases that exist in society and propagate themselves in AI systems through the organizations who develop AI systems and the organizations that deploy them and use them. And there's also the human related biases, especially in scenarios where we are teaming up AI systems with humans to make decisions, whether it's consumer credit underwriting decisions or hiring decisions or any other kind of decision. You have essentially two biased entities interacting with each other. You have an AI system that's biased, and then you have a human who is riddled with all kinds of cognitive biases and emotions and things like that. So what happens in this interaction? Do these biases attenuate each other, or are they amplifying each other? The fact of the matter is that many organizations think that, oh, as soon as we throw the human in the mix, everything is solved. But we beg to differ a little and say, hey, we need to study this interaction and understand what influences the human in making the decision assisted by the AI. And so a lot more science needs to happen here to actually understand it better before we can issue meaningful guidance in the various contexts of applications of AI. And so again, in this project that I mentioned, we are going to try to work with representatives in the financial services community to understand a little bit about this phenomenon, and hopefully some useful guidance will come out of it in the end.
Right. And I think absolutely right. Like both of those perspectives make a ton of sense. For me, when I think about this issue, I think it applies across the life cycle, right? And one of the things that often sort of goes underappreciated, as it were, is thinking about where the composition of the team and the design choices that they make, how that actually sets up the foundation for downstream like bias to manifest, right? So if you are only seeking to collect data from particular sources, or the way you're going about collecting data, so if you're relying only on data that can be collected via a smartphone, you are by default excluding people who don't have access to a smartphone, right? Or if you're looking at reaching people via social media, those who don't have social media accounts will not be reachable. And so those sorts of biases can manifest obviously in the data that's represented, but even prior to data collection, in the form of the design choices that you make to even source that data in the first place, right? And of course, when you think about the feedback loops that exist in the context of how that system is deployed in practice, um, that is another place where where bias starts to manifest, in the sense that you can take an example of an AI system that let's say is supposed to gather um, uh, or feedback into machine translation, right? And if there is differential performance of machine translation systems from languages that are more dominant and more performant, so usually tends to be English, um, and let's say that this is a chatbot system, where this machine translation is deployed in customer service, let's say, you already will get pretty good feedback from your customers who are in English, maybe because of the performance and the usage of that system, versus in places where maybe customers exit that chatbot flow because they often find that the performance in languages outside of English isn't great. And so bias then starts to manifest in subtle ways in the design choices and the deployment of an AI system outside of that context as well. So I think all that said, just reinforcing what Supreet and Apostol said, and I think the NIST our AI RMF actually does lay that out across the govern, map, manage, and measure framework, which actually makes it very concrete for everyday practitioners.
Mhm. I think there's a need for a distinction in a lot of the examples, which I agree with, that we're drawing on, between, let's say, the primary data and the ways that how data is then made ready for these systems, and the output of these systems. But also there's secondary or tertiary effects that are happening. Let's say inequalities built into the landscape that provides internet access, for your example, that then denies entire communities access to the internet. And so that's something more infrastructural that isn't directly related to the AI system, but is in fact influencing the kinds of data that can be inputted into it. If we're thinking about these contexts, what do you have any ideas or best practices about what steps can be taken to make these systems more transparent, more explainable or understandable by non-experts, and ways that could be audited, especially by kind of human elements?
Right. I mean, I think there's a lot of questions packed into that single question. Maybe I'll pick one slice, and I'll leave the other slices for Supreet and Apostle to chime in on. I think when we talk about explainability, there's often a very, very strong focus on uh, you know not leaning on more complicated models, or leaning in on techniques like SHAP and LIME to explain the models that are a little bit more complicated, or leaning in on models like trees, which are just by sort of virtue of what they are, just a lot more explainable. I think what also needs to be emphasized is, again, the design surface, right? The interface that is used when humans are interacting with machines. So, making that concrete. If you look at a clinical decision support system, a healthcare practitioner who is using that AI system in the process of providing patient care, maybe, when we're thinking about that, how are we communicating the results, right? So, should it be communicated in a traffic light system, right? So talking about like red, green, and yellow in terms of, or should we be talking about it in terms of percentages, probabilities? Is that something that is more intelligible to them? And so when we talk about that idea of explainability, right, you who is the counterpart? Like you're explaining it to someone, so it needs to be intelligible to that person. And so what are their needs? What are their knowledge? What is the background? What is the context for those people who you're explaining it to? I think is equally important in the sense that it widens the surface for where you can do explainability in the first place, right? So it means that maybe there is a redesign on the interface that might help the healthcare practitioner in this context. And it's not just about picking a more explainable model, but maybe investing in that interface, making it more intelligible uh, to the stakeholder, to the healthcare practitioner in this case.
It's a great point. Any thoughts?
I would second that and add, for instance, one little detail when it talks about explainability. It's always important, if possible, to know which feature of the model contributes the most to the decision that was being made in the end somehow. And not only that, but allow the
Looks like
I think we just lost him.
Yes, a little bit of a connection issue. While we wait for him to come back, Supreet, would you like to voice your thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I mean, I'll just voice it independent of what he was saying. So I think obviously explainable AI is kind of, an element that you can use along with your AI to make the black box more like, a glass box approach and all of those things. But I think more than that, there's also a human in the loop element, right? Though AI can help us in automation and can make our life easier, I still feel that that element of having SMEs and other folks who chime in, and then you gather their feedback and then you retrain your model is also utmost necessary, along with the the technical aspect of it. So yeah, that is like one aspect, and just the other is there's an element of drift that comes in the AI models, once they're in production. So it's often the auditing and the monitoring part is also very necessary, just to ensure that it's possible that your model might be fair and unbiased and doing well just when you deployed it, but later on, as the data started collecting, it started drifting away from your expectations. So that is another element that is important. Sorry, Apostol, you can continue.
Yeah, I was saying that one element is that, sorry for the interruption, by the way, is the ability to trace a feature to the decision that is made about the constituents, right? And not just that, but to allow the constituent or the subject of the decision to play scenarios around that and say, okay, if I improved on this feature or this aspect of my data, can I get a more favorable decision made out of the AI? And if you are able to deliver this sort of experience with an AI system, I think you can gain trustworthiness and sort of understanding and transparency about it that would help to gain trust in the technology.
And this circles back a little bit to one of our first questions about ensuring things are inclusive and fair, and identifying, as you said, Apostol, where these decisions are being made. Because I think what we wouldn't want is to, let's say there is a human auditing the process. It's not the first time human decision-making has interacted with the model, in that human decision-making influences the kinds of data, the way the model operates, the checks that are performed during it. And so adding in kind of a transparent understanding of where those human decision-makings really take effect and the impact they have, I think is also important in being transparent. But just because something's transparent doesn't mean that it is explainable or understandable to the public. And just because we can explain it readily doesn't mean that the processes are in fact transparent. And I think there's going to be this tension that we have to navigate between those kind of two factors. Because at a certain point, there are things that you need to know. about the processes to understand it. And then other things that aren't influencing it as much, and how to balance that need is, I think, an important way to move forward. But also, speaking of these needs, how do we balance the need for this kind of innovation with also the need to protect the public, to protect individuals, to protect rights, to protect the people that it's designed to serve?
Well, that's a very big challenge, John. Given the fact that the reality is models nowadays ingest larger and larger amounts of data, and the more a data segment is repeated in it, like a name or a phone number or an address, the more likely it is the model will spit it out at some point, whether as a result of a specific query or as a result of a random query. And so privacy and security or robustness or resilience, or however you want to name it, are central issues with machine learning. The trouble is that there isn't a single silver bullet, a technique that would allow you to protect all of this information if you enhanced your model with it. All mitigation techniques, attacks on privacy and security, are limited today. We don't have, a foolproof mechanism of protecting the model. And so I think organizations need to think creatively to figure out ways to maybe wrap the model in a layer of IT infrastructure that would limit the ability of attackers to query it at length, so that they wouldn't be able to extract the information they're after, or some other creative techniques of that kind to help models cope with the avalanche of challenges they're going to experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just add another point on the data privacy aspect, right? Which I think bothers a lot of users, and people are becoming brand conscious, and they want to know how their data is being used and if it's being used in the right way. I think as a practitioner, it's the onus is on them to think hard whether they would like to use some of the attributes of the PII data, which basically is your age, your gender, all of those things. Do they really want to use that to train the model? If it's obviously something like predicting cancer, right, those features might have a bigger impact. But then again, if it's some things like predicting maybe loan, those things might not be as important. So it has to be use case driven, and it has to you just need to do like a gut check at that time. So there, like, obviously a layer of audit is important, and if they are not sure, data science is such a collaborative process that at that point it's important to understand and discuss with others just to see what features are really required to train.
Hey, John, and I think, when we think about this need to balance innovation with the desire that users have towards protecting, their privacy, their security, I think when we look at what investments will actually help get us there, you looking at techniques like federated learning, looking at techniques like secure multi-party computation, these sorts of techniques are a concrete vehicle that allows us to harness the power that machine learning brings, at the same time catering to the desire that users have towards protecting their privacy, uh, etc. Right? And I think we aren't seeing the same amount of investment and research, as it were, into privacy enhancing, or what's called privacy enhancing technologies, PETs, as we are towards some of the other areas in the field of ethical AI, like bias mitigation, which I think is a shame, because if we are able to help address some of the concerns that exist on the PII front, right, from a privacy protection front, like if we invest more deeply in PETs, And there are quite a few, organizations like Open Mind that develop open source software that anybody can go and access. It's called PySift, is one of their implementations. That will start to also help bridge the problems that we have on in terms of bias, for example, because if we have more representative data sets, and I'm not saying that that's a panacea, I mean, we just sort of explored all the ways that bias can manifest, but at least it'll also help bridge that gap, right, where you can have more representative data sets because people are a little bit more confident in being able to share their data. And again, like, none of these methods are perfect, right? Like, when we talk about, like, differential privacy, of course there is a trade-off in terms of utility um, and the privacy protection that it offers. But I think it's a concrete vehicle to do that, right? And it also then starts to move again from, like, high level commitments to principles to actually doing something on the ground and testing these techniques, right? Because the ultimate arbiter of whether any of this works or not is if you take these techniques and put them out into real world use cases and see where they work and where they don't, right? Rather than just, I think, being caught up in the theoreticals of it.
Mhm. A lot of these that we're talking about right now, especially come from necessarily so, come from the position of the user or the end user, the one whose data is being deployed or whose privacy is that we're concerned about. And those are important questions. But also, some of the ways that we push innovation forward is through for-profit companies. So from the business standpoint, how do we marry those things? How do we give the transparency and the confidence and build the trust that users may have in the security of their information while still keeping proprietary what's important for a business to operate?
For me, it's about, I think, communicating the process and the governance and the structure that the organization has put forward or is implementing towards responsible AI, at the broadest level, right? And I feel that what we see today is that there are some organizations who are doing good work in responsible AI, but are not necessarily communicating what the underlying processes, the governance mechanisms are in detail, which I think will help, right? And to your point on, like, well, do we want to give away IP or the exact functioning of those systems? It isn't about that in particular. It's about what is the process, right? Like, as long as I think you can develop confidence in the process of how those systems are developed and put out, I think that, to me, is much more valuable than talking about specific instances of systems that are, again, very broadly speaking, responsible. So if I have confidence in the process being responsible, I would give that more emphasis over just sort of, let's say, certifying. I know that certifying means a lot of different things, but very loosely speaking, certifying a specific instance, I would rather certify the process.
Yeah, that speaks to me as well. I think one way to improve the transparency of the process could be with independent audits of the process by auditors who are recognized by the community or accredited by the community to perform this function. And so you can think of, nowadays we are worrying in some sectors of the labor market, how is AI going to negatively impact those jobs and get rid of them. But here is in one example where AI actually may create new jobs by creating the need for such independent audits, and having this ecosystem of auditors who could actually attest the process in specific organizations and show that they are actually transparent and robust and open, and by that we can gain more trust in the models that they develop or the system that they deliver. So being transparent here doesn't necessarily mean that you have to divulge all of your corporate secrets to the world.
Any thoughts on that, Supreet? Oh,
But
I think you might. Oh, there you are. Okay.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can now.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I was saying, yeah, those two are definitely, two valid aspects of this responsible AI framework. But at the end of the day, both of those are only possible, if you know the behind the scenes of a model. So at the end of the day, all those, if you have those explainable AI frameworks going and someone is auditing and all of those things, it's then that you'll be able to make your users comfortable, right? And that is also when the knowledge management teams in the companies and those who educate the customers on different aspects can come into play. And through fun interactive sessions and videos, they can basically guide them what's happening behind the scenes of their any XYZ product. So definitely those are some of the valid suggestions.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Apostle, I wanted to go back to kind of your example of job creation in terms of, some ethical dilemmas that I struggle with. And while I do think it's important to highlight opportunities for job creation created by these systems, I do also struggle with that the jobs created are often not accessible by those the systems replaced. So if we think about that in terms of, let's say, cars, if you have a way to replace the mechanical engineering, the need to go to an auto body shop and have people physically work on your car, with a one-stop shop that you can pull a car into and it gets fixed by a set of processes, the person who maintains that highly technical infrastructure is not the same that is replaced by that processes, the mechanic, for example. And so when we think about ethics or when we think about fairness, I don't think we can just look at, let's say, jobs in aggregate, but rather the communities that are benefited by this, and if different than the communities that are affected by it.
Yeah, that's a great question or a problem, John, you're bringing up. But if you look historically at the issue of in terms of technological revolutions over time, right? That problem has existed and has been with humanity for eternity. Every time technology changes, certain jobs disappear, others appear, and they're not exactly the same jobs. I mean, they're not taken by the people who were displaced, And so I think now that we live in more affluent, more civilized society, we can think of ways to soften the blow for those who get displaced in order to maybe help them educate and requalify to take some of these newly created jobs. I'm not an expert in that area, but I see the problem you are raising, and I can only offer you this historical experience to say that this ain't anything new that I haven't seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts on that, or other ethical concerns that or tensions that you all struggle with that you want to bring up? We have about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to give you a quick time check.
I think just one of the ethical concerns that I have been reading and I've seen people facing is, and kind of bothers me, especially during the application processing stage of so most of these big companies have these ATS systems and everything. And sometimes if those systems are biased, it's possible that a lot of qualified candidates get filtered just because of their gender, or just because historically the data hasn't seen those genders coming up. And this has been a problem which is very prevalent, and I would recommend everyone, read about this in Trustworthy AI. It's a very good book. So I think that is like one of the biggest concern that personally I feel, can be catered and should be catered maybe through these discussions, and, we can come up with something. But I feel like that is a challenge, that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
And John, maybe just like a last point, I know, as we head into the final few minutes of the panel, I think it always behooves us to take a step back and see whether AI is even the right solution, right, to be used. I think often a challenge that I see, prop up quite frequently is when we don't think about the feasibility of using an AI solution in the first place. So, overextending an AI system to solve a use case, which is infeasible with the current capabilities that the system has to offer, or the data that you have access to, or the infrastructure that you have access to deploy the system, and reasonably support it while it is out in the wild. That ends up leading to a lot of ethical challenges because you just don't have sufficient capacity or sufficient capability to service the use case. And that sometimes, I think, not using an AI system, maybe opting for something that is simpler, as it were, can be a way to uh, address that. And I think there's a question on the title of the book that Supreet was mentioning. It's called Trustworthy AI by Beena Manath, in case folks are interested
Yeah.
in the book.
John, one other thought I had regarding the problem that you raised is the fact that the initial expectation was that AI will displace mostly blue collar jobs, but it seems like at the moment there's many white collar jobs could be that are easier to replace with AI than blue collar jobs. And then the question is, if you think about the white collar job people, they're more amenable to retraining and requalification in other domains because they have access to presumably higher grades of education and all, and maybe better means to, or higher means to participate in other trainings and things like this. So there is a little bit, I think, the potential to offset some of the severity of the problem with AI job displacement, if you like.
No, interesting point. So we only have about a minute remaining. So before I close us off, Supreet, is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, I think we all, covered it well. Thank you, everyone, for being patient listeners.
Yes, I wanted to second that. Thank you so much for taking the time out here today. And Abhishek, I think that's a perfect way to end this off, is, evaluating if AI is in fact the right tool for the job, not just if it can do it. So again, thank you all for joining me today, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.